Good evening. Welcome to the Black Doctoral Network weekly web series, Conversation Starters. I'm your moderator, Fese Longe, and I'm thrilled that you could join us for another wonderful episode. Tonight, we'll be talking about diversity in leadership in the workplace. Joining me this evening, we have three expert scholars that are going to share their insight on this topic. Joining me first is Dr. Crystal Sellers-Battle, who is the Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Juniata College in Huntington, Pennsylvania. Dr. Sellers-Battle focuses on creating initiatives and strategies for furthering equity and inclusion efforts on campus, such as mentoring programs for student athletes, as well as bias incident response protocols. I welcome you, Dr. Sellers-Battle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Our second panelist joining us this evening is Dr. Skylar Walks, who's the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion, as well as Assistant Professor of Instruction of Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Walks focuses on recruitment, selection, and appointment, as well as retention of diverse students, faculty, and staff. I welcome you, Dr. Walks.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. And our last panelist joining us this evening is Mr. Thomas Flunker, who's the Director of the Center for Inclusive Excellence at Gustavus Adolphus College. Mr. Faulkner focuses on mentoring and advising all students through their educational journey. I welcome you, Mr. Faulkner.
Honored to be here. Thank you.
All right. So I'm thrilled that you could join us. So let's go ahead and get started on these wonderful questions that I have for everyone. So the first question that I have is, how would you describe the relationship between diversity and leadership in the workplace? Dr. Sellers-Battle.
I was thinking about this very question a little bit earlier, and thank you for asking. I believe they're directly intertwined because the reality is that in our leadership protocols, we should be thinking about leading all, and diversity is about representing all. And so while we think of those things, they have to be directly intertwined. Not to say that all leadership is successful in doing so, but our efforts are to basically think about how do we lead all, how do we support all, and then diversity is how we represent all. And so I think there is a huge direct correlation and connection between those two.
Thank you, Dr. Sellers-Battle. Dr. Waltz.
Thank you for that. I definitely agree with Dr. Sellers-Battle. I think most importantly, based on my experience and perspective, I think genuine and authentic leadership understands that diversity is critical. It's not an add-on. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be in response to a crisis. It can't be something that happens only because of an incident, right? Or because there's a sudden trend. It has to be something that is genuinely a part of the culture of the organization or institution. And if it hasn't been historically, and quite frankly, for most of our historically white and predominantly white institutions, it has not. There has to be an intentional effort to make those efforts supported fiscally, to make those efforts supported in terms of staff, to make those efforts rewardable and not just with the taxation of those who have affinity, identity, or relationships with those particular diversity categories, but also something that is seriously taken into consideration in terms of upward mobility. How are you contributing to this need? What is your track record with this need? What does your trajectory and goal ideation look like with this need? And I think those are things of which leaders can definitely create very clear objectives around that show and demonstrate to their communities, institutionally or organizationally, that this matters, that this is not just lip service, and that they will put resources behind the activation of those items.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz. Mr. Fluckner.
I would echo everything that has been said so far. And I think, it's really important to understand that the history of an organization or an institution can tell you quite a bit about what the relationship means to them by how they go about it. And sometimes the history gets in the way of moving forward with diversity being at the helm of leadership in the workplace, right? And we see that quite a bit. Because that hasn't been a thought process for many institutions and organizations ever. And because of that, it's very difficult to see that change take place. And so the relationship there, you can see, especially when it's quite young in nature, it struggles quite a bit. But, like both of my colleagues said before, what it should look like, you should be able to see the intentionality behind it throughout, everything that is being done. It's not a one-off kind of scenario. It's not something that is an add-on to what people are doing already. It should be a part of every aspect of the culture of an organization.
Thank you all for those great points. This actually leads us to our next question that I have for you all is, what are some benefits and challenges in the promotion of diversity in leadership positions? Mr. Flunkner.
Well, the benefits and challenges, it kind of comes at the same, roughly around the same time, to be honest with you. The benefits of it is once you start recognizing the need for that type of diversity in leadership, when you recognize that, organizations and companies can actually start making those changes, both visible as well as in terms of procedures and policies and things like that. And that benefits the entire institution, the entire organization, when those movements start to take place. And that's an incredible feeling when people can see that, when they can feel that. The challenge a lot of times that I see is that when that type of change starts to take place, people are happy at the beginning. They may be skeptical, but they're happy to see it.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you get a little comfortable in what those changes starting to look like, or when you see that momentum is slowed down, then you start seeing some of the mindsets change about it, right? It's like, well, see, this didn't work really. It's just it's a fad, or you may see those who really would like to see more change take place actually back off of being involved and being intentional themselves, because they don't really believe that the institution and organizations are truly meaning what they're doing. And that can be really a frustrating thing, because it takes, you've probably heard this a ton lately, where it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, right?
Right. No, thank you, Mr. Flunker. What are your thoughts, Dr. Sellers-Battle?
I have to say I definitely resonate with the last thing that Mr. Flunker said, because I arrived at this institution probably about 4.5 months ago. And the challenge with coming in as a new diversity officer, usually the institutions are in one of two places. Either they're completely oblivious of what's going on, or they are desperately hemorrhaging. And so I use this reference a little bit about my institution, and they won't be surprised that I've said that, because they've heard me say it many, many times, is that I arrived at a campus where a lot of people were hemorrhaging from uncertainty, from social unrest, from economic uncertainty and pandemic uncertainty. And so the diversity person was to come in and either fix the immediate hemorrhage or do the long-term work to figure out why the hemorrhage was even there in the first place. And if you ask one set of the team, they'll say, fix the immediate hemorrhage and keep moving. And then you ask another part of the team and they're like, let's go back and see what the structure is that exists that either needs to be removed or the structure that is missing that needs to be erected. And the challenge is figuring out what the balance is. And in the middle of that, as I'm sure many of us in diversity feel like, we've been asked to address this without any medical records, without any testing protocols. We just kind of get thrown into it, and we have to decide which place we live in. Do we want to? So I think the benefit is that we bring someone in who can identify the hemorrhage, but the challenge is, do we get enough time to fix it?
Thank you, Dr. Sellers Battle. And Dr. Walks.
Well, I feel like in many ways, my colleagues have already brilliantly said the most important points. I'd like to add to what they've already shared with us that I think one consideration in terms of a benefit is the obvious. A more diverse space is not going to be the sole benefit. It has to be an inclusive space that also espouses a strong sense of belonging. And that's the activation that's the most radical. Because oftentimes a lot of institutions and a lot of organizations think that if they have the quantifiable diversity, right? So there's numbers, I'm not saying quotas, of course, but there's numbers, or there's a visible diverse representation in the community, then they've achieved something. And that's actually a very low bar. That should be something that should be happening, absolutely, but that's not where the work starts. And quite frankly, where in my experience in scholarship and research also shows this, more resistance actually happens around activation regarding inclusive practices, right? And then the cultural shift around belonging. And so I think that's the greatest challenge. And I also agree with Mr. Flunker's point about oftentimes there's a genuine, and I say this sincerely, there's a genuine excitement and enthusiasm when the diversity, equity, accessibility, and I'm always going to add accessibility because it continues to be left out of the DEI conversation. So I always refer to my work as DEAI or DEAAI, and the A's are for accessibility and anti-racism, right? Because we have to address racism as an institutional ill, as a systemic and structural ill as well, within the auspices of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I say all that to say, one of the greatest challenges, to Mr. Flunker's point, is that this enthusiasm is very present in the beginning. But then oftentimes individuals who've not had to consistently and routinely engage diversity work, themes, concepts, and inclusion, they tend to suffer from a fatigue quite early. And I say that respectfully because oftentimes those who have experienced marginality or oppression have a much stronger immune system to the fatigue of it, because it's something that's embedded in our daily experiences and lived realities. And we can't often opt out, right? And so what tends to happen when that fatigue hits after the enthusiasm wanes is oftentimes less work, less visibility around the work, lower attendance in programs, a smaller pool of folks who are willing to lead initiatives or take on certain things on their own. And we have to be very careful to not let, again, the efforts and the energy go back to the folks who are already experiencing marginality with this additional tax. So I think calling out the fatigue, not in a punitive way, but saying this is something around which we must be accountable because it's part of our strategic effort.
Thank you, Dr. Wall. And thank you all for just sharing your perspectives on this question. It really helps us to understand those benefits and challenges. So I thank you all. The next question that I have is, how has the current political climate influenced diversity in leadership positions? Dr. Sellers Battle.
I will have to say it's impacted it in one of two ways. I think in it feels like in my sphere, either it's further how do we want to put it, puts a microscope on it in some ways, in the way that Dr. Walks was mentioning in regards to the fatigue, because now all of a sudden the political climate has made everything, to some people, the people who are less, usually not our marginalized brothers and sisters, usually it is for those who don't live in that marginalized space, have either done one of two things: allowed the political climate to make them feel like they are now all of a sudden marginalized, or they are using it as an opportunity to create an us against them divide amongst us. I am in a part of I'm living in a very, 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 very politically conservative environment right now. And for our students, especially our marginalized students, they are feeling very much in a fishbowl, feeling like they're very visible, very isolated, feeling very not wrapped or embraced in the way that they really want to be, because of fear of response. And I can completely understand it moving into this particular area. And so what we're finding is that the political climate is either saying, I'm not sure about you. I'm not sure if you have value. I'm not sure if you really bring anything to the table. Or it is, you know what, because I believe a certain way, I'm going to be a sister in the struggle with you when you really don't have anything to be a sister in the struggle about. I was talking to some students earlier today about this desire that sometimes non-marginalized groups have this fetish with becoming marginalized, and I do not understand it. That has been a baffling moment. And I think this political climate has now created this space where people now all of a sudden are like, I am marginalized because I feel this way. And so it's become that. And then the second thing is that now, because we don't agree with each other, we create mobs and we basically march to the Capitol. So it has now become a place where there's so much tension amongst those that don't agree with each other. So now that we are taking this mob mentality and we are going and we are storming the Capitol and making our presence known. And I think a little bit has to do with that marginalization fetish, for lack of a better phrase for that. And so it becomes really, really challenging to kind of walk that very delicate line between what is happening because of our political climate. So.
No, thank you, Dr. Sellers Battle. And Dr. Walks, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, I was in Dr. Sellers Battle's amen corner. That was so brilliantly said. I think there's a tension, quite frankly, to Dr. Sellers Battle's point around a need to feel proximate to oppression, even if it's imagined, and also a desire to feel visible and also to feel a sense of autonomy with power. And I think that's the tension point in a lot of spaces and around this work. I also think it matters quite a bit where you land, right? Depending on the political climate and the space that you're in, the environment you're in, the actual state politics. For example, if you are a public institution, those are, again, points of tension. These are things I think that have to be considered very strategically, because even in an effort to do the most, to do the best, to do the work that needs to be done, and not to do it in a performative way, there's also, quite frankly, a line that is very difficult sometimes to navigate, a political line to toe, if you will. Because if you do too much too soon, you get labeled as a radical. If you don't do enough in response to whatever eruption there may have been, or if there was some controversy on campus or within your institutional space or within your community or city or town, and you're not responsive enough, then you may be accused of not, and I'm talking about workers in this area, not any individual. You may be accused of not being someone who has, and forgive the ableist language, but who has their feet on the ground, who's able to be precipitative in the way in which they react and respond, or proactively respond to issues and challenges. So it's a tightrope and it's difficult. But I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that you don't ever go into a performative space. Sometimes that may be difficult for some to resist, not me personally, just because of the integrity that I hope and pray to always bring to this work, because it's both heart work for me and head work for me. It is my vocation. But I also understand and respect that a lot of folks struggle with that. Because for a lot of folks in this, if I'm getting very real with you, for a lot of folks doing diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work, there are a lot of people who have a lot of expectations from you, but at the same time don't ever want to be offended or feel unimportant. And that in and of itself is a very political space in which to operate. So being strategic while being authentic, I think, is the best advice I could give.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wall. Mr. Fluckner.
it's a challenging time. I'm not going to lie. Being at a very traditional, predominantly white institution, that has a quite significant social justice minded student body. Um, it's interesting to see when you have intentional change, because I mean, our core values are very specific, and social justice, is at the crux of a lot of that. And so we recognize as an institution, and our president is at the helm of that. She came in with a very DEI mindset, coming out of the business world. She recognizes where we're at as an institution and the changes that need to be made. Um, would like to see things move more quickly, obviously, but
Mhm.
higher ed has a tendency of not being as quite as quick as the business world. um, but when things have happened surrounding us in everything from what we just experienced in Kenosha to George Floyd, to, I mean, all of these scenarios, our students aren't silent about that. Yeah, they don't care that this is a traditional PWI. They demand change, and they demand it now. And my colleagues probably have seen a lot of this take place too. Um, and our campus responds quickly to that. um, you know, and so the response that you get at our campus is changes that needed to be taking place earlier, but now they've gotten to that point where we can't hold this off any longer. So then the changes take place. The center that I'm in used to be in the building next door, and we've been in this new space as of the end of right at the beginning of February this year. We moved over here. This space is over 4 times the size of where we were before. The entire facility got remodeled, to the specifications that I asked for. Right. Um, that kind of stuff happened quickly on campus. We have a brand new inaugural vice president of equity and inclusion. Never had that before. That's new. New counseling staff in the counseling center that are BIPOC. All those things happened. But also considering the fact that we have a pretty strong traditional alumni backing on this campus. When these things started to take place, oh, and I will add one other thing: our campus sits right on indigenous land, right? And so we have an arboretum that's been a part of this campus since we moved here, and it was named after somebody who had conflicting messages when it came to not only BIPOC individuals, but also in terms of the connection that we have with indigenous populations in this area, right? So the name change did just recently happen, and now it's just called the Gustavus Arboretum in the meantime. When those types of things took place, the reality is, because of the backing that we have of people who don't understand this, we heard it. We heard from alumni who basically were saying that they were going to pull their funding, and things of that nature. We have also awakened and what I call the true or the hidden personalities that a lot of the individuals that are both on our campus or are family members of people in our campus, who were quite upset that we were just falling to all of these fads of changes that need to take place. So we're right in the middle of making all these changes that really should be happening to make our campus much more diverse, much more inclusive, and we have people who don't fully understand it or are resisting it because they don't like the idea of that type of change. And that that just tells you what they've thought deep down inside about all this, probably since the beginning, if not before.
No, thank you for that feedback. But what I'm hearing is that the political climate does have an immense effect on diversity, inclusion, accessibility, practices that are definitely happening. So I thank you all for your insight. The next question that I have is, do you believe that organizational culture can influence the effectiveness of diversity practices? Dr. Waltz.
Well, I think that's true. I also think the inverse is true. I think diversity practices, when they are effectively implemented, can also influence and shift organizational culture. I prefer saying it that way, largely because any place that we enter, whether it's our home, whether it's our community, whether it's our institution, place of work, our familial network, there's already an existing culture. And I believe that those cultures don't have to be static, but they can be stagnant. And so I think bringing in diversity practices has to be done with care. Bringing in diversity practices has to be done with intention. And bringing in diversity practices, and again, I'm going back to what I said previously, cannot be performative. Because it is on trend right now, because it is something around which the United States seem to have experienced a collective awakening, which some people call a reckoning. Many of us were in tune with this long before May 25th of 2020. There is a different kind of energy. There's a surge and a desire to activate. And some of that is very tangible. It's seen in the way that structures are desiring shifts. It's seen in the hiring of positions. It's seen in the way that strategic plans are being reshaped. It's seen in the way that mission statements are being redone. It's seen in the removal of certain names from certain buildings. But in other ways, it may be a little less tangible. And quite frankly, it could be criticized as being performative. It may just be that one letter of support that went out on June 1st after the fervor of the nation was witnessed. It may have been a speech. So I think all of these things are critical considerations around first assessing what is the authentic culture of which you are a part. Some of us believe we are existing in one culture because we're insiders, and then outsiders may have a completely different perspective. Okay, so I think gauging that barometer of who you are is important, and that can be done by implementing metrics. I think the second thing is to think about, what does effective diversity practices mean to you? What does that mean to you? What does that look like? Because it may mean something at the institutional level versus among our students, among our staff, among our faculty, and depending on where you are, what type of institution or corporation or organization you are a part of, you also have to ask yourself, who holds the greatest influence and the most power? Because there may be a groundswell, quite frankly, but if there are stakeholders who are not willing to shift the culture, regardless of what is the outcry for a change in practices, that's going to be difficult. And so I think the two can work in tandem. I don't think, certainly there's a correlation, but I don't think one is strictly related to being the effect and one being the cause. I think these two things can be very fluid.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz. And just reaching out to our audience members, I hope you're enjoying this wonderful conversation that we are having this evening. Please feel free to comment, share. Our panelists here are ready and available to answer any of the questions that you may have throughout this conversation. What are your thoughts, Dr. Sellers-Battle?
I thank you, Dr. Waltz, for the way that you flipped that for me. I was kind of thinking it in the first manner, because I can say that organizational culture will definitely impact the effectiveness of diversity practices if there isn't 100% buy-in. And even it may not necessarily need to be 100% buy-in, but I think it's going to need to be at least a good 80 to 90% buy-in in order to move the needle. And so what I've found most recently is that sometimes the culture feels that they have awakened, or they're woke enough that they don't really need to move. And so then that makes the diversity practice very difficult to continue, or move the process forward in some ways. And so my piece of it has been that how do we connect with those that feel like they have arrived, or are in the place that they feel, oh, we are awakened, we know it all, we are ready. How do we embrace them and then bring them to the table to understand that let's partner together? Your how awake you are is going to help me, because in a lot of places, we as diversity officers are usually a one, two, or half of a person trying to move the entire needle of an entire institution or connection. And so rather than us work and say, oh, I've arrived, I am woke, I have it all figured out, let's work together. So then we can turn that one person into 12 and use the groundswell that Dr. Walks was talking about to really move some organizational things forward. But one of the places that I feel that on the reverse is that the diversity practices can also do, and I think is really important, is helping the organizational culture to understand that it needs to operate under a level of cultural humility and understanding. And a lot of times our organizational cultures move in a business awareness and a business culture and a business humility, but not necessarily in a cultural intelligence or cultural humility. And I think that's really important for us to think about. How do we make the organizational culture move through those lines?
No, those are wonderful points, Dr. Sellers Battle. Mr. Flunkner, what are your thoughts?
I think the only thing that I will add to this, just because everything has been said so eloquently, I when you take on the responsibility of pushing for change like this, it has to be consistent. I mean, I understand that it's tiresome, but the thing is, it has to be ongoing and consistent, so that the campus sees that no, this is not a fad, this isn't going away, or campus or any other type of organization for that matter. So being consistent about showing everybody why this is important, and therefore we are going to continue down this. Now, having said that, the other thing that we have to take into consideration is that the whole idea of one size fits all, you have to be really cautious about that too, because what works for us here on this particular at this particular institution may not work somewhere else, right? You have to be intentional about understanding what's a part of the culture that's already there, and what so trial and error is going to be a part of what you do. There are best practices, but this best practice may not be what you're looking for in order to reach the audience that you're trying to reach at the place that you're at. But it has to be consistent, it has to be ongoing, and you really have to be mindful of what's going to work for that particular institution. And like you said, Dr. Sellers, about the fact that you find that population that you can work with first, right? Let's get them on board, let's help them to understand, and then we have a bigger mass, and then we can continue to move from there.
Thank you, Mr. Fluckner. And Dr. Wall, you had one additional information?
Yeah, I did actually. I think it's just important to recognize that organizational cultures influence practices. Practices help to define policies, right? And processes. And I think this is really important for us to remember, because oftentimes we think of culture as the warm and fuzzy, but it actually has the power to create something that is systemic. It actually has the power to impact processes that then become policies. So I just think we need to also recognize how much power organizational culture holds, even if it feels intangible. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm learning so much from this conversation, and I hope the audience is too. This is so rich of information, and really, I appreciate you all for breaking it down the way you all are, because a lot of people don't really understand that relationship between the organization and where the practices and diversity does come from. So I thank you all for doing that. The next question that I have is, how would you describe the relationship between diversity and inclusion as it relates to employee retention. Dr. Sellers Battle.
I was wondering if you were going to get me first on this one, because this I could write a novel on this one, but I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So prior to becoming a dean of EDI, I was a faculty member for 12 years and chair of a department at another liberal arts private institution. And and my DEI work became almost in some ways other duties as assigned, right? And so I have been passionate about this work for a long time, but it felt like the additional teaching load in essence. So I'm doing a full teaching load, but then also adding the diversity, equity, and inclusion component to it. And so then it gets exhausting. Because of the desire to want to carry, or the institution may be in some ways asking you to carry the weight of the entire DEI efforts, or being, as I mentioned earlier, one of the people to help move the culture, or help move the organizational piece. And so those other duties is assigned for those that may be a part of marginalized groups, but don't necessarily have as much of the passion. Then what we find is that people get exhausted very quickly, and those additional responsibilities, those additional expectations above and beyond what they were brought to the institution to do, sometimes it causes us to lose our passion about what it is we really came to the institution to do. I came to the institution, my background is in music. I came to the institution to be a classical voice teacher. But sometimes there were moments where those other duties as a DEI professional, alongside my full teaching load, caused some exhaustion. And so sometimes that retention, that could be the piece of it. Now, on the flip side, if diversity and inclusion is done well, then those faculty members can focus on what it is that they've come to the institution to do, because there is a fully staffed diversity and inclusion office that is helping to move the culture forward.
No, thank you, Dr. Sellers Battle. And as I said, this conversation is amazing, and we do have some feedback or question coming from one of our audience members, from Ms. Sarah Jean Lay, who wants to know, for corporations that technically have diversity programs and practices, how can we address limited or absent diverse hiring in pockets of our community that lack diversity? I'm going to select one of the panelists to answer this question. Dr. Waltz.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Sarah. I think first and foremost, limited pools can never be an excuse. And quite frankly, lots of institutions, organizations, and corporations have leaned on that for a very long time. Because the reason why I say it cannot be an excuse is actually twofold. One, because it diminishes the fact that the talent exists. Two, it also says that you're okay with not doing the additional work to seek and identify that talent. So I think the first thing that needs to happen, regardless of what your community looks like in terms of diversity, is that you do very intentional outreach for recruitment. And you don't just stop there, because I can't tell you how often that happens, where it's like, whoo, we have X amount of candidates who identify with Y historically underrepresented or marginalized identity. Our work here is done. No, it's not, because the other piece is retention. So you may be able to attract some talent, but you also have to remember that with that diverse talent, they are often being wooed by other places and spaces. So what tends to happen, and I'll be very frank in my response here, what tends to happen is that organizations and institutions that have historically relied on their reputation and that hold, if we build it, they will come because we are who we are mentality, doesn't tend to work for historically underrepresented groups and groups who have experienced marginality. That's not enough. Folks want to know that when they go there, is it culturally safe? Okay, this is even different than being culturally responsive. You can be culturally responsive all you want, but if I go there and I don't feel culturally safe, I don't want to stay there. The second thing, consider the family. If the person has a family, Are their children going to be the only child of that particular identity in that classroom? Is the school district inclusive? Okay, so it's more than just about numbers, because I think that tends to be something that confuses a lot of institutional leadership. They think, well, we threw X amount in terms of a salary as a lure for this particular talented person. Why aren't they coming? Well, what more did you do? Did you introduce them to affinity spaces within your organization or institution or corporation? Did you talk to them about experiences or introduce them to other folks who could talk to them about experiences as someone representative of that particular identity? Because you have to be honest of what you cannot talk about. I think that's where we have to be a little bit more authentic sometimes in our recruitment work, and saying, you know what, I can't engage you authentically in that way, but I would love to connect you with X or Y person who can do it more authentically for you and share their lived experience. Knowing that I'm not assuming that you're monolithic, but I don't want to disrespect you by telling you what my experience is and I can't relate to who you are. So I think those are the things that we have to do, and go to the affinity groups like the Black Doctoral Network. If you're looking for PhDs, MDs, DDSs, PharmDs, the D's keep going with the Black Doctoral Network and the like, not only BDN, but and the like, and ask them about their talent, because the talent is there, but do the work to identify it and recruit it with authentic measures and methods. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Walks, for a fabulous response to that question. Would you like to answer our employee retention question?
Were you asking me, Fessy?
Yes.
Oh,
Dr.
okay. I will humbly punt to my colleagues.
Okay, Mr. Pluckner.
I'm still navigating everything that you just shared with us, in terms of the answer to the question in the poll. One of the things that I will say about the relationship between diversity and inclusion as it relates to employee retention, when an institution or organization is going through the process of seriously thinking about DEI or DEAAI, as you put it before, you can't just look at one aspect of change, right? Because of what you said, we've all brought to the table about the different personalities and different traditions and things that have been a part of the college. If you truly want to retain the employees that you have, and you're going to have to take a look at every aspect of your policies, every aspect of your procedures, every aspect of what do we do to help the people that we have, that source of that runs everything. How do we make them feel like they're valued? How do we make them feel that they're welcome? How do we make them feel included in what the institution has to offer? And so, that relationship is huge. It spans every aspect of this area, this work, this topic, because of the fact that you have employees that come from all walks of life. And so no matter what racial, ethnic background, identity you have to take all of it into consideration. And I get that that's hard work. And I get that it takes a long time, but it has to be done. Otherwise, you can put this program in place and you can put this policy in place, but you're going to miss something, and somebody's going to feel it. And when somebody feels it, one of the things that I've said since I've been at this institution for less than 5 years, and I may have a different mindset about how I navigate things, but one of the things that individuals who think about this and wake up every day thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, because it's a part of our being, you notice and feel when people leave, right? And my guess is that, when you feel that, you also know the reasons why people leave, right? And so, describe the relationship. The relationship, it's it's intertwined. It's intertwined, in every aspect of DEI. And so the intentionality of an organization and institution, it has to be sweeping. It has to go through the entire organization in order for true change to take place and to recognize the value that employees, bring to the organization.
Thank you, Mr. Flunkner. Dr. Sellers-Battle, you have something to add?
I just had one quick thing about, and this was related back to what both of my colleagues were talking about. Sometimes there's a traditional element in some institutions, and so sometimes there's a reticence to go and look at the policies again and make sure that they are effective and useful for the time that we're in. And we just had a moment where we had to really step back and look at our policy and say that there are changes in our culture and our environment in our country right now. And so now we need to think about, how do we update these policies to make sure that everyone is feeling included? And so really, pushing the institution to think about that. Yes, historically, we may have been doing this, but now we're in a space where we need to think differently about how these policies impact everyone on campus.
No, thank you all for just all this information. I'm definitely enlightened now, and hope our audience members are as well. So since we're talking about the employee side of the organization and diversity, I want to continue with another question that I have is, how important is employee engagement when developing a formal workplace diversity program? Mr. Flunkner.
I was thinking about this earlier, and thank you for sending these to us in advance. Give me a little chance to really, not only reflect on this, but I believe that employee engagement, and people have to understand what that means, though. I mean, engagement means that the employees are connected to the organization in a live way, right? It's one of those things where we talk a lot of times about, pieces of an institution or an organization being siloed, right? Or not being transparent enough, right? And things of that nature. And so the employee in an organization, if they're not engaged with what's going on in the institution, they're definitely not going to be engaged with diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Even if that's something that means something to them, you can't separate the two. You can't. So when we talk about the connection between diversity program or not diversity program, employee engagement, and then the diversity program itself, finding ways to utilize the strengths and talents that employees bring to the table is a crucial component of it, right? Finding ways to get rid of that feeling of loneliness, that feeling of not being valued, all of those things that's a part of this. So to me, that relationship is crucial for any type of diversity program, any type of diversity work to take place within the institution, because the change that actually comes from those individuals, right? And from the people who understand that those individuals are what makes the institution what it is. There was another point that I had, but I got lost in a lot of the stuff before. So if it comes back to me, I'll make sure I bring it up.
I'm happy to continue, if that's okay. I think one of the other things that's important to consider with respect to how important it is for employee engagement when developing a formal workplace diversity program is to not conflate equity and equality, and to also not conflate inclusion and belonging. Oftentimes what happens in this work, because it's quite frankly, it can feel like it's jargon heavy work if you are jargon laden, if you are not as familiar with the terms and where they are derived from and what they mean and the intentionality behind their application, is that they're often used synonymously, right? Like we'll swap out equity for equality, we'll swap out inclusion for belonging. No, belonging is one of the most radical, because belonging means that you are not going to insist that the labor be on the individual who is different to adapt or acquiesce or to assimilate to the existing culture that is largely a hegemonic culture, right? That's why it's radical, because that has historically been the track record for most institutional and even communal spaces. The person who's different must assimilate or adapt. And oftentimes it's done quietly. And oftentimes it's done without even being asked to do it because of the internalized oppression that most individuals who experience marginality already have. We're already grappling with that. So rather than, you hear things like, I don't want to make waves, so I'll just do X. When you come in, keep your head down. Don't ask too many questions, girl, because you know people get upset. I mean, these you hear these also from affinity communities, right? And that's largely because they are accustomed to assimilating, shifting, acquiescing in ways that somehow diminish aspects of their difference, even if what their difference is helps to augment the beauty of the space. And I mean that in terms of talent, thoughts, etc. And so when we're talking about engagement, employee engagement, I think we have to be very clear about the terminology. What do you mean? What are you talking about? And secondly, and use it intentionally, right? And then the second thing is, please give people credit for what they ideate and conceptualize. I cannot say that enough, because what often happens is a lot of the ideation comes from the folks who are experiencing various forms of oppression or various forms of marginality. And so they've already been thinking, I would be willing to bet money on this. They've already been thinking about potential solutions for years. And then when they have the opportunity and the support and the platform to present it, what I also have seen, and I've heard this from others as their experience, someone comes in, co-ops it, and gets the credit for it. And that's not okay. And if you are truly aspiring to be an ally in this work, you have to be willing to say, what's happened, what I'm going to do is ensure that the person, regardless of their title, regardless of the capital they have in this space, are going to be acknowledged for their ideation or contributions to the creation of this program.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz. Dr. Sellers-Battle.
I agree with everything my colleagues have said. And another piece of this, especially in the higher ed environment, what's really important is to also make sure that the employee engagement is for those who most desperately need it. What we find is that we create these workforce diversity programs, and the people who are connected to it tend to engage. Those that are not connected tend to revert back. And what we have to do is that the leadership has to be bold and has to say, okay, we're going to require this for people. You need to be actively engaged in this work. You really have to think about it. And then also put some parameters in place for those that are not willing to engage in it. Because that has been a big piece of it, is that we, especially in the higher ed environment, we are continuing to promote and to give special practices to professionals that may be based on their educational ability, their research, all the things that they have done, but we haven't really always calculated who they are as a person. Then once we've had them for a while, then usually who they are as a person becomes a challenge, and we haven't addressed that ahead of time. And so we really have to think about, how do we become radical in our leadership to make sure that the people who most desperately need to be introduced to the idea of cultural intelligence, humility, workplace diversity, treating people with respect and love and support, that's where we have to be radical and say, we're going to require this of you. You can try to opt out if you want to, but the reality is that we are going to say, you need this, we all need it. We're going to come to a mutual collection together, and we are going to do this work. Sorry, that was the Pentecostal preacher dad in me. I got on my soapbox for a minute, and I realized I need to bring my blood pressure down a little bit. So,
if I may, because you answered the question that I actually wanted to ask Dr. Sellers, I would like to hear Dr. Walk's, comment about that same thing. When it comes to the programs that we offer, obviously our campus is steered clear from the word trainings and things like that, right? You've all heard of that. But I also, I struggle with this idea of, we have this mandatory component that, like Title IX, we have that's a mandatory thing that you have to do, as an employee every year, right? And there may be other things that have to do with technology that are mandatory. When it comes to the campus and the organizational movement on diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, all of those things, what is your stance on, the option or the mandatory component of it, or somewhere in between?
So I'll try to be brief. Brevity is not my strong point, but I'm going to try to exercise it now. Two things. DEAI work is not yet held in the same regard as compliance models. Okay, so the examples that you used, ADA, Title IX, EEOC, those are all actionable items around litigious interventions. When folks violate those terms, those policies, those laws, there is recourse. There's an action, legal recourse. So it then moves into compliance. It's no longer just about culture. It's shifted into compliance, right? The DEAI is not yet at that point beyond the very basic kind of equality frameworks that we operate around. And that's why I say that's the lowest bar. So let's not conflate equity and belonging and inclusion with equality. That means you're just doing what the law says you have to do. Let's not celebrate enthusiastically to do that. That should be done anyway. The second thing I'll say with respect to your question, Dr. Flunker, is that I also believe there's a way to do that based on accountability. So you have language, you have mandates which say that this is something you must do. Then you have measures and metrics attached to accountability. So in my college, in my institution, I helped develop for our FAR, which is our faculty annual review, a DEAI component. In academia, we know that the trifecta of things that determine your success are research and scholarship, teaching, and service. Well, what we did, as a consequence of my pushing this for the past year and a half, 2 years, is we have implemented DEAI across all three of those. So it still doesn't, I'm still holding fast to my philosophy. It's not going to be an add-on. It's not, and here's the supplement. What DEAI work have you done? No. How are you integrating DEAI into your scholarship and research? How are you integrating it into your service? And how are you integrating it into your teaching? And that challenges folks to get creative and to, quite frankly, become students if they're not familiar with these themes and concepts, which is necessary, because in order for us to be able to teach 21st century learners, we can no longer be behind the curve. They've already outpaced us in that regard, and they're expecting us to show up ready to engage and be able to meet them where they are with respect to the discourse that is already being used in the world and networks.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Walks, and just thank all your panelists. This is some powerful, informative information that you all have shared with us this evening. We have a lot of, as you can see, our audience members are very much so engaged in this conversation. And I just want to say a huge thank you to each one of you all for taking time out this evening to really provide some education to our audience and really break down what diversity and leadership looks like in the workplace setting, as well as in the organization or any type of institution. So I thank you all tremendously for being able to do that this evening. Before we go, I do have one additional question to ask you because we have concluded tonight's segment. My question is, how has the Black Doctoral Network impacted you professionally or personally since you have been with us? Dr. Walks.
I love BDN. I'll be very honest with you. It's very rare that there is a space that offers you affinity support that feels like it's an organic community and that also allows you the creative and academic license to connect with others who not only have a certain kind of like-mindedness in terms of what you feel is important, but who are also brilliant. They're brilliant researchers, they're brilliant educators, they're innovative, they're curious. We have very talented graduate students. So this network for me is one that has been invaluable. And it also introduces you to a very diverse group of folks, right? So you learn every time you get together, you learn, but you also have a beautiful opportunity to fellowship. So it's not only about networking, which is important, it's also about the beauty of community building. And I love that. So personally and professionally, it has done nothing but inspire and uplift me. It fills my cup.
Thank you, Dr. Walks. And we really appreciate you being part of the BDN network. And we hope that you continue to stay with us and provide your insight and your scholarship. Dr. Sellers-Battle.
I have to say, it has been wonderful to just feel like I'm connected with people in a way where I can let my hair down. When you are working at a predominantly white institution, sometimes you might feel a little bit isolated, but sometimes there's a way that you can just go to BDN on Facebook or on social media and feel like, oh my God, they get it. I can let my hair down. I can enjoy this experience. I can realize that there are other brothers and sisters in the struggle, and really feel supported and understand that there are people who are really getting it. And the amount of resources and support that I have found and been able to connect with people and hearing what people are doing, and the webcasts and all of the podcasts have been really, really helpful in me thinking about how I frame my work. It's wonderful. But it's also just great to just see Black excellence. I love it. I love it. I love it. I crave it. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Dr. Sellers-Battle. And Mr. Flunkner.
I will tell you, I have not been tied into this network for more than just last 2 years, to be honest with you. And once I got connected with this network, my eyes were open in many different ways. I've had opportunities to do networking of different kinds with different groups, but being a part of this group has strengthened me, as tonight's conversation did, to be surrounded with not only like-minded but also with high a high level thinking about the work that we do and the journey that we have to endure and go through, and to have that affirmation that while my story is different and my journey is different, and my goals may be different, our collective search for knowledge, change, growth, and the opportunities that we have to share what we can bring to the table and what we have to offer is there through this network. And for me to be able to not only connect live like this with colleagues and others in that way, to be able to go into the network and be able to, like was already brought up, the podcasts and the webcasts, and to be able to just, fill my cup, even on the spot, even if I'm not connecting with somebody live, has been increasingly, valuable to me. And so I'm thankful for this opportunity tonight, and I'm thankful for being a part of this network.
Thank you, Mr. Faulkner. So this concludes our evening of a wonderful conversation on diversity and leadership in the workplace. Again, I would like to thank our panelists for taking time out this evening. This has been a fabulous conversation. Our audience members have thoroughly enjoyed it, and we appreciate you all being part of the BDN network. And we hope to have you guys definitely be a part of another conversation that we have. But before we go, please share some contact information with the audience in case they would like to further connect with you. Dr. Sellers-Battle.
I can be connected at my email address, which is battlec, at juniata, juniata.edu, or at the website for the consulting firm I share with the dear friend, Dr. Lisa Beckley Roberts, www.diemaconsulting.com, who does, we as a group do equity, diversity, and inclusion consulting work for schools of music. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, those are places where you can find me. Thank you so much for having me. This has been an incredible experience.
Thank you. And Mr. Flunkner.
I will share with you that I don't know how they get that across to my email address is my first name, and then my last name is Flunker, just the way it sounds. When I was a principal, when students would enroll, they would freak out because they saw my last name and they didn't know if they wanted to go to school there. So, but tflunker@gustavus.edu is how you can get a hold of me. Thank you for the opportunity, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Flunkner. And Dr. Walks.
I love that. Shout out to K-12 educators. That's where it all starts. I bet that made for some interesting introductions. So I have LinkedIn and I have my email. Though I will let you know, I am being very disciplined this year. I am taking a real respite from technology this break. I can not only encourage my community, my students, staff, and faculty to do this, I need to also activate around what I encourage others to do. And I'm being disciplined for the first time in a very long time to do that. So please do email me, reach out to me on LinkedIn, but know that I may not get back to you until the new year.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening on Conversation Starters. If you have enjoyed Conversation Starters and would like to keep up to date with the latest BDN developments, please be sure to check us out on blackphdnetwork.org and become a member, or follow us on Facebook at Black Doctoral Network. Please be sure to share this live session with your friends, families, colleagues, and professional networks. I am your moderator, Fesse Longe, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good evening.